There is something deeply strange about the way humans chose to build their world. If you were to take a map of the Earth, any map from any century, and trace your finger along the edges of its great rivers, its coastlines, its bays and estuaries and deltas, you would find, almost without exception, that you were also tracing the outline of civilization itself. The cities are there. They have always been there, clinging to the banks of rivers, spreading outward from natural harbours, growing up around the places where the land meets the water and seems almost to hesitate before giving way to the deep. London sits astride the Thames. Paris was born on an island in the Seine and grew outward from there, following the river as though it had no choice. New York occupies one of the greatest natural harbours on the Atlantic coast. Shanghai commands the mouth of the Yangtze. Buenos Aires faces the widest river in the world. Cairo exists because of the Nile, and without the Nile, nothing about Egypt as we know it would be possible. Istanbul straddles the single most strategically important waterway in all of Europe and Asia. Mumbai, Sydney, Hong Kong, Rotterdam, Dubai, Singapore. The list goes on, and it does not end, and when you look at it long enough it begins to feel less like a list of cities and more like a list of places where the water decided to let humans stay. Tonight, we're going to trace that story from its very beginning. We're going to follow the water backward, through the steam-powered ports of the Industrial Revolution, through the tall-masted empires of the Age of Sail, through the medieval trading cities that grew up on European rivers, through the Viking longships threading their way between continents, through the great harbour cities of the ancient world, all the way back to the first moment a small group of human beings stood on the edge of a river and understood, in whatever way humans understand things before they have words for them, that staying here was better than moving on, that the water would provide, that the city, though they did not yet know to call it that, would grow. This is not a simple story. It is not a story with a single cause or a single moment of beginning. It is a story made of thousands of smaller stories, each one happening in a different part of the world, among people who had never heard of each other, speaking languages that bore no resemblance to one another, praying to entirely different gods, and yet all arriving, through their own separate reasoning, at the same extraordinary conclusion: build near the water. Before we dive into that story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this quiet little corner of the internet where history and the sea meet somewhere around midnight. And thank you sincerely for being here. Settle in. We have a long way to go. To understand why cities grow near water, you have to first understand what the world looked like before there were cities at all. You have to go back roughly 12,000 years to a time when the last great ice age was releasing its grip on the northern hemisphere, when glaciers that had been stationary for tens of thousands of years were retreating, melting, sending their cold water cascading southward in rivers that carved entirely new channels through the landscape. The world was warming, the forests were advancing, and small bands of human beings, who had for tens of thousands of years been nomadic, following herds, following seasons, carrying everything they owned on their backs or in their hands, were beginning, for the first time, to slow down. The question of why humans settled where they did is one that archaeologists have been trying to answer for well over a century, and the evidence keeps pointing to the same conclusion. They settled near water, not always the sea, often a river or a lake, or even a reliable seasonal spring. But the water was almost always there, and its presence was never accidental. It was, in every case, the reason. Consider what water meant to a community of several hundred people in 9000 BCE. It meant drinking, obviously. Without clean water within walking distance, a settlement of any size was simply impossible. But it meant far more than that. It meant food. Rivers and lakes were full of fish, and fish were among the most reliable sources of protein available to early humans. Unlike the great herds of deer or aurochs that could be hunted but never guaranteed, a well-placed fish trap in a river could produce food day after day, week after week, through summer and winter alike. Rivers also attracted animals, deer, boar, birds of all kinds, that came to drink at predictable times and in predictable places, making the hunters' work not only easier but more consistent. And then there was something else, something that took early humans some time to fully understand, but that would eventually become the single most transformative discovery in the history of human civilization. The soil near rivers was different. It was darker, richer, full of something that the soil away from rivers simply did not have. What it had was silt, the fine particles of sediment carried downstream from mountains and highlands, deposited on riverbanks by the annual flood, layered year after year into a deep, extraordinarily fertile topsoil that would grow almost anything you planted in it. This is the secret of the river. This is the thing that turned settlements into cities. The first place on Earth where this truth was understood at a civilizational scale, where it was not just practiced but systematically exploited, organized and built upon, was a region that the ancient Greeks would one day call Mesopotamia. The name comes from two Greek words meaning between the rivers, and the rivers in question were the Tigris and the Euphrates, two great waterways that rose in the mountains of what is now eastern Turkey and flowed southeastward through what is now Iraq, eventually emptying into the Persian Gulf. Between them and around them stretched a vast floodplain, flat, treeless, subject to enormous seasonal floods, that was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the least hospitable landscapes on Earth for human habitation. There were no forests to provide timber. There was no stone for building. The heat in summer was punishing. The floods, when they came, were violent and unpredictable. A person looking at Mesopotamia in 5000 BCE would have been forgiven for concluding that nothing of importance would ever happen there. And yet it was here, on this flat, difficult, river-threaded plain, that human beings first built cities, here that they first developed writing, here that they first created law codes, organized religion, standing armies, and long-distance trade. The rivers did not merely support this civilization, they made it possible. They shaped its character, they determined its geography, and they gave it its calendar, its agricultural cycles, and its deepest religious beliefs. The gods of Mesopotamia were, in almost every case, gods of water and flood. Enki, the great Sumerian deity of wisdom, lived beneath the sweet waters of the underground ocean. Enlil, lord of wind and storm, controlled the floods that brought life and the floods that brought death. You did not separate the spiritual world of Mesopotamia from its water, because you could not. The water was everywhere. It was everything. The city of Uruk, which appears in the archaeological record around 4000 BCE, and which may have been the largest city on Earth during the 4th millennium, sat near the Euphrates, and owed its existence entirely to the network of irrigation canals that Sumerian engineers had spent generations constructing and maintaining. These canals were works of extraordinary sophistication, carefully graded, precisely aligned, equipped with sluice gates that could be opened and closed to direct water where it was needed. They turned the Mesopotamian floodplain from a semi-desert into a garden, and the city that organized and administered this garden, that kept the canals clean, that decided who got water and when, that collected the agricultural surplus and redistributed it, became, in the process of doing all that work, something the world had never seen before: a state. Gilgamesh, the great king of Uruk, whose name appears in what may be the world's oldest written story, is in the Epic of Gilgamesh described as the man who built the Great Walls of Uruk. Great walls that, when excavated by German archaeologists in the early 20th century, proved to be real. The walls existed. They enclosed an area of roughly 6 square kilometres, and they were built, archaeologists believe, not primarily as a military fortification, but as a boundary, a declaration of civic identity. This is the city. This is where we live. This is what we have made from the water and the land. Inside these walls is civilization, and outside them is the wilderness that we have been gradually learning to leave behind. Downstream from Uruk, southward toward the Persian Gulf, other cities were growing by the same logic: Eridu, Lagash, Nippur. Each of them sat near the water, and each of them organized its life around the water in exactly the same way: irrigation, agriculture, surplus, trade. The rivers were roads as well as water sources. The earliest boats on the Euphrates were simple reed bundles, buoyant enough to carry a man and a load of grain from one settlement to another without getting wet. Later came wooden boats, then larger wooden boats, then boats with sails. The river was not merely the reason for the city's existence. It was the city's highway, its connection to the wider world, the artery through which its prosperity flowed. There is a document from ancient Ur that archaeologists call the Lamentation over the Destruction of Ur, a Sumerian text dating to roughly 2000 BCE, composed after the city had been sacked by the armies of the Elamites from what is now southwestern Iran. The lament is extraordinary, page after page of anguished poetry describing the destruction of the city's temples, the scattering of its people, the silencing of its music. And running through it, again and again, is the image of the canals gone dry, the boats idle, the water gone still. Because if you were a Sumerian poet in 2000 BCE trying to describe the death of a city, the image you reached for was not fire or blood or fallen walls. It was dry canals, the absence of water. Because that was what the city was. It was the water and the life that the water made possible. The pattern established in Mesopotamia was not unique to that region. It was being repeated independently in 4 other places on Earth at roughly the same time. On the banks of the Nile, Egyptian civilization was taking shape. In the valley of the Indus River, in what is now Pakistan, a sophisticated urban culture was building cities with planned street grids and advanced sewage systems that would not be matched in the Western world for several thousand years. Along the Yellow River in northern China, the foundations of Chinese civilization were being laid, and in the river valleys of the Yucatan and Mesoamerica, the beginnings of the great American civilizations were stirring. 5 civilizations, 5 rivers, 5 entirely separate stories arriving at the same conclusion. The water was not just where the people were, it was why the people were. Of all the rivers in the world, none has shaped a civilization more completely, more profoundly, or more visibly than the Nile has shaped Egypt. The relationship between the river and the people is so total, so all-encompassing, that it is almost impossible to speak of ancient Egypt as a political or cultural entity separate from the river that gave it life. Egypt, as the ancient Greek historian Herodotus famously observed, was the gift of the Nile. And while that phrase has been repeated so often it has lost some of its power, the truth it contains has not diminished at all. Egypt is the Nile. Everything else about the country, its agriculture, its religion, its art, its politics, its calendar, its architecture, its understanding of life and death, flows from that central fact. The Nile is unlike most rivers in one crucial respect. It flows from south to north. It rises in the highlands of equatorial Africa, travels more than 4,000 miles through some of the world's most inhospitable terrain, and finally empties into the Mediterranean through a broad delta on the northern coast of Egypt. This peculiarity of direction has profound cultural consequences. It means that when you sailed upstream on the Nile, toward the south, toward the river's source, you were going against the current. And when you sailed downstream, toward the north, toward the sea, the current carried you. But here is the extraordinary thing about the Nile Valley. The prevailing wind in Egypt blows from the north, which means that a boat with a sail heading upstream could use the wind for propulsion, and a boat heading downstream could use the current. Ancient Egyptian sailors could navigate the entire length of Egypt in both directions, using only sail and current without needing to row at all. The river, in other words, was a two-way highway, engineered by nature for the convenience of the people who lived along it, and they used it. They used it for everything. The great limestone blocks that built the pyramids at Giza were quarried at Aswan, nearly 600 miles upstream, and floated down the Nile on enormous wooden barges during the annual flood season, when the water was high enough to carry the weight. The sandstone temples of Luxor and Karnak were built from stone that came by river. The quartzite obelisks of the New Kingdom pharaohs, some of them weighing hundreds of tons, were shipped downstream and then erected in front of temples by a workforce whose logistics were organised around the river's seasonal rhythms. You could not build a pyramid without the Nile. The Nile was the construction crane, the delivery truck, and the labour organiser all at once. But it was the flood itself that was the river's greatest gift, and the flood was not a disaster. In Egypt, the annual inundation of the Nile was not something to be feared. It was something to be celebrated, to be prayed for, to be measured and recorded and anticipated with a combination of religious devotion and agricultural practicality that had no precise equivalent anywhere else on Earth. The flood came every year between June and September, driven by the monsoon rains that fell on the highlands of Ethiopia and sent a pulse of water northward through the desert. When the flood reached Egypt, it spread across the narrow valley floor, depositing a thin layer of dark, rich silt on every field it touched. When the water retreated, it left behind the most fertile soil in the ancient world, soil that required no fertilizer, no irrigation, no extraordinary effort to cultivate. You planted your seeds in it, and things grew. The desert, which stretched away in every direction just beyond the flood's reach, was called by the Egyptians the Red Land, the land of death, of Set the god of chaos, of the unknown and the dangerous. The narrow strip of flood-irrigated farmland along the river they called the Black Land, after the colour of the silt. The Black Land was Egypt. The Red Land was everything else. This geography, a narrow river valley flanked by desert, created something unusual in the ancient world, a civilization with natural borders. Egypt did not need great walls or standing armies to defend its eastern and western flanks, because the desert provided all the defence it needed. What it needed to defend was the river itself, the northern coast where the delta met the sea, and the southern frontier where the Nile descended through rocky cataracts that were difficult to navigate. This made Egypt, for much of its history, one of the most stable and long-lived political entities in the ancient world. Pharaohs came and went, dynasties rose and fell, foreign rulers occasionally seized the throne, but Egypt endured because the Nile endured, and the civilization that the Nile had made was too deeply rooted in the river to be easily uprooted. Memphis, the first great capital of unified Egypt, was built at the point where the Nile Valley narrows and the delta begins to spread northward, a location of almost perfect strategic logic, sitting at the junction between Upper Egypt to the south and Lower Egypt to the north, commanding both the river traffic and the agricultural output of the delta. Its exact position shifted slightly over the centuries as the Nile's channel migrated as rivers' channels do, but the city remained at the same general location for nearly 3,000 years. Thebes, the later capital, the city of Karnak and Luxor and the Valley of the Kings, sat further upstream, deep in the heart of Upper Egypt, surrounded by cliffs on the west bank and farmland on the east, connected to the rest of the country entirely by the river. Alexandria, built by Alexander the Great at the western edge of the delta in 331 BCE, turned its face toward the Mediterranean and became a great port, but it was built where it was precisely because it sat at the mouth of one of the Nile's distributary channels, and because the harbour at that location was exceptional. The Egyptian understanding of the afterlife was shaped by the river in ways both obvious and subtle. The west bank of the Nile was associated with death and burial because the sun set in the west, and because the desert cliffs on the western side of the valley provided the dry, stable conditions that were ideal for tombs. The east bank was associated with life and the living, because the sun rose in the east, and because that was where the farmland was. Osiris, the god of the dead and of resurrection, was associated with the Nile flood, his annual death and rebirth mirroring the flood's retreat and return. The pharaoh in death was Osiris. In life, he was Ra, the sun god, and Ra travelled across the sky each day in a solar bark, a boat. Even the heavens, in the Egyptian imagination, were navigated by river. What is perhaps most striking about the Egyptian civilization, when you look at it across its full span of 3,000 years, is how consistent it remained. The same artistic conventions, the same religious themes, the same architectural forms appear at the beginning and at the end with an almost uncanny consistency. Scholars have argued about why Egyptian culture was so resistant to change, and the answers they propose tend to be political or religious. But there is another answer that deserves more attention than it usually receives. The Nile did not change. It came every year with the same flood, receded every year at the same time, deposited its silt, and retreated. The agricultural cycle it imposed was rigid and reliable, and a civilization organized around a rigid and reliable agricultural cycle does not need to innovate in the same way that a civilization facing unpredictable conditions does. The Nile gave Egypt stability. It gave it predictability. It gave it, in some sense, the luxury of tradition. There were exceptions, of course. There were years when the flood did not come, or came too violently, or arrived at the wrong time, and those years were catastrophic. The ancient Egyptians knew this, and their prayers were full of petitions for the flood to be just right. Not too little, which meant famine, and not too great, which meant destruction. The ideal flood was a very specific thing, and the instrument they used to measure it, a nilometer, a graduated column built at the water's edge to track the rising level of the flood, became one of the most important objects in Egyptian governance. A nilometer reading that was too low meant tax remissions and food distribution from the royal granaries. A reading that was too high meant engineering responses, opening canals to distribute the excess water, shoring up dikes, relocating vulnerable communities. The nilometer was not just a measurement device. It was, in a sense, the instrument of state. The city of Aswan, at the southern edge of traditional Egypt, grew up around the first cataract of the Nile, the first place where the river tumbled over rocky outcroppings and became unnavigable from the south. This made Aswan a natural border city, a customs checkpoint, a place where goods from sub-Saharan Africa, ivory, ebony, gold, exotic animals, enslaved people, entered the Egyptian world. The great granite quarries nearby supplied the hardest stone in Egypt to builders and sculptors throughout the country. Aswan was not the capital, and it was never the largest city, but it was indispensable, because the river made it so, and because the river stopped there, it became the place where the river's power to connect also became the river's limit. All of this, the agriculture, the flood calendar, the building projects, the trade, the theology, the political structure, was the river. When Napoleon scientists arrived in Egypt in 1798 as part of the French expedition, and began the systematic documentation of Egyptian antiquities that would give birth to the science of Egyptology, they were overwhelmed by what they found. Not just the scale of it, the pyramids and temples that dwarfed anything in Europe, but the completeness. A civilization that had run continuously for 3,000 years and left behind a physical record so extensive, so detailed, so legible even across the gulf of millennia that it seemed almost impossible. But it was not impossible. It was the river. A civilization that builds beside a great river and organizes its entire existence around that river's gifts and demands does not need to move. It stays, and because it stays, it accumulates. It layers civilization upon civilization, temple upon temple, city upon city. And what it leaves behind is not a ruin. It is a palimpsest, a text written over and over on the same page, in the same place, for 3,000 years. Because the river was always there, and the river was always worth staying for. Sometime around 2000 BCE, A new kind of civilization was beginning to stir along the northern coast of the Aegean Sea, in the rocky, island-studded waters between what is now Greece and Turkey. It was a civilization that would eventually produce philosophy, democracy, tragedy, the Olympic Games, the foundations of Western science and mathematics. And it would do all of this because of the sea. Not in spite of it, not alongside it, but because of it. The sea was not the backdrop to Greek civilization. It was its engine. It was the medium through which Greek culture travelled, the source of Greek wealth, the highway along which Greek ideas moved from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. The geography of Greece is worth dwelling on, because it is unlike the river-valley geography of Mesopotamia and Egypt in almost every respect. Greece is mountainous, rocky, and fragmented. The arable land is scarce and scattered, tucked into small coastal plains and narrow valleys between ranges, of limestone hills that make overland travel slow and exhausting. There is no great river in Greece worth speaking of. There is no Nile, no Euphrates, no broad floodplain covered in deep silt ready for cultivation. What Greece has, in extraordinary abundance, is coastline. The Peloponnese Peninsula alone has more than 1,000 kilometres of coastline for a landmass that is smaller than some American counties. The islands, the Cyclades, the Dodecanese, the Ionian Islands, Crete, Lesbos, Chios, and hundreds of smaller ones, multiply the available coastline to an almost absurd degree. And along that coastline, in dozens of small natural harbours and rocky coves, the Greek city-states grew up. They grew up as separate cities, not as a unified nation, and this was the sea's doing as much as anything else. The mountains between the coastal plains were high enough and difficult enough to make overland connection between communities slow and unreliable, but the sea connected them, imperfectly, seasonally, dependent on wind and weather, but still fundamentally in a way that the mountains could not. A merchant from Corinth could sail to Athens in a day with a fair wind. The same journey overland took 3 days through rocky terrain. A Spartan army marching to fight in northern Greece took weeks. A fleet of warships could cover the same distance in days. The sea was not just easier, it was transformatively faster, and in the ancient world speed was power. Corinth is perhaps the clearest example of what a maritime position could mean for a Greek city-state. Corinth sat at the narrow neck of land that joins the Peloponnese to mainland Greece, the Isthmus of Corinth, and it had harbours on both sides of that isthmus, one facing east toward the Aegean and one facing west toward the Adriatic. Every ship that wanted to sail between eastern and western Greece had to either pass through Corinthian waters or make the long and dangerous voyage around the entire Peloponnese. For centuries, Corinth solved this problem by building a paved portage road, the Diolkos, across the isthmus, along which ships could be dragged on wooden rollers from one harbour to the other, paying a toll to Corinth for the privilege. The city became fabulously wealthy not by manufacturing goods or growing crops, but simply by sitting at the hinge point of 2 seas and charging everyone who passed through. Athens achieved its greatness by a different route, but the sea was equally central to it. In the 5th century BCE, at the height of its power, Athens was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population of perhaps 300,000 people in the city and its surrounding territory. It could not feed all those people from its own land. Attica, the region surrounding Athens, was rocky and poor and capable of producing olive oil and wine in abundance, but grain only in limited quantities. Athens got its grain from the Black Sea coast, from the Greek colonies, that had been established around the shores of that distant sea in places that are now Ukraine and Romania and Bulgaria. Those grain ships sailed from the Black Sea through the Bosphorus, down the Aegean, around the tip of Attica, and into the harbour of Piraeus, Athens' port city, about 8 kilometres from the city itself, connected to it by the famous long walls that Pericles built and that turned the space between the city and its port into a single fortified unit that could be supplied by sea even if the land surrounding it was occupied by an enemy. The Long Walls were a statement of philosophy as much as strategy. They said, in stone and mortar, that Athens understood itself as a maritime power, that its life depended on the sea, that it was prepared to abandon the land to an enemy rather than cut itself off from its harbour. And this was exactly what happened during the Peloponnesian War, when the Spartan army marched into Attica and burned the farmland and cut down the olive trees, and the Athenians retreated inside the Long Walls and let them do it, because the grain ships were still coming from the Black Sea, and as long as the grain ships came, Athens could endure. The man most responsible for this maritime strategy was Themistocles, an Athenian politician of the early 5th century, who looked at his city and understood something that many of his contemporaries did not want to accept, that Athens' future lay on the water, not the land. When a silver strike at the Laurian mines in 483 BCE put a sudden windfall of cash in the Athenian treasury, Themistocles argued, against considerable opposition, that the money should be spent on warships, not on grain distribution, not on public buildings, not on paying off the city's debts, but on triremes, the fast-oared warships that were the dominant naval technology of the ancient Mediterranean. He got his way, and Athens built 200 triremes. 2 years later, when the Persian king Xerxes led his vast army and navy into Greece, those 200 ships met the Persian fleet in the narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the Attic coast, and destroyed it. The Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE is one of the hinge points of Western history. It was fought in a narrow channel specifically because Themistocles understood that the Persian fleet's numerical advantage was negated in confined waters, where the faster and more manoeuvrable Athenian triremes could pick apart a fleet that had no room to use its numbers effectively. The battle was a Greek victory, the Persian invasion collapsed, and Athens emerged not merely as a victor, but as the undisputed leader of the Greek world, the head of a maritime alliance, the Delian League, that gave it access to tribute from dozens of island and coastal city-states stretching from the Bosphorus to Sicily. The Athenian Empire was a maritime empire. Its tribute was paid in silver, but the wealth behind that silver was the sea. The Piraeus harbour that Themistocles developed into the principal port of Athens was, in the 5th century BCE, one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world. It had 3 separate harbours, one for the commercial fleet, 2 for the military, with stone ship sheds that could house up to 372 triremes out of the water, protected from the elements, ready for deployment. There were warehouses, marketplaces, lodging houses, temples, and a cosmopolitan population of merchants, sailors, craftsmen, and traders from every corner of the Mediterranean. Piraeus was the kind of place where you could find a Phoenician merchant and an Egyptian scribe, and a Scythian soldier and a Carthaginian shipwright all in the same harbourside tavern, conducting business in a mixture of Greek and half a dozen other languages, and nobody thought that was particularly unusual. The harbour created a kind of international zone, a space where the normal rules of Greek civic identity were relaxed, because the business of the sea required a more flexible kind of belonging. This cosmopolitanism of port cities is a theme that will appear again and again as we move through this story. It is not unique to Athens. Every great port city in history has been, to some degree, a place where the usual boundaries of culture and nationality and religion become more permeable than they are inland. The sea brings strangers, and strangers bring things that the city does not already have. Goods, yes, but also ideas, techniques, beliefs, stories. The harbour is where the world comes to visit, and the city that sits beside the harbour absorbs some of what it brings. It is not accidental that so many of the intellectual revolutions of human history, the Greek Enlightenment, the Italian Renaissance, the Dutch Golden Age, the British Industrial Revolution, happened in port cities. The harbour is where the world comes in. The Romans had a name for the Mediterranean Sea that reveals in 2 words exactly how they understood their relationship to it. They called it Mare Nostrum, our sea, not the Great Sea, our sea. A possessive that carries within it an entire political program, a civilizational ambition, a declaration of intent that took several centuries of warfare and diplomacy and engineering to make fully real, but that, at the height of Roman power, was essentially accurate. For roughly 500 years, from the defeat of Carthage in the 2nd century BCE to the fragmentation of the Western Empire in the 5th century CE, Rome controlled or directly influenced essentially every port, every shoreline, every island, and every major river mouth around the full circumference of the Mediterranean. It was the most complete exercise of maritime territorial control in the ancient world. Rome itself, though it would grow to be the greatest city of the ancient world, began as something rather modest, a collection of settlements on the hills overlooking a bend in the Tiber River about 25 kilometres from the coast. The traditional founding date is 753 BCE, though the archaeological evidence suggests continuous settlement in the area going back much further than that. What the site had going for it was, again, water, and not just the Tiber. The location sat near a ford where the river could be crossed, and downstream from that ford was an island, the Isola Tiberina, that made the crossing easier still. In a landscape of hills and marshes, this river crossing was the natural place for roads to converge, for trade to pass through, for people to gather. The Tiber connected Rome to the sea. It was not the easiest connection. The river was shallow in places, prone to flooding, and navigable by fully loaded ocean-going ships, only as far upstream as Ostia, near the river's mouth. But it was a connection, and for the first centuries of Rome's existence it was enough. Grain came up the Tiber by barge, salt, one of the most economically critical commodities of the ancient world, came from the salt pans at the river's mouth along the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, which is one of the oldest roads in Italy, and whose name tells you everything you need to know about what was travelling on it. Timber came downstream from the Apennine forests, and the city at the bend in the river, sitting at the crossing point, grew fat and complex on the transit of all these things. But Rome's ambitions quickly outgrew what the Tiber could provide. The conquest of Italy, completed in the early 3rd century BCE, gave Rome a peninsula with 2 long coastlines, one facing west toward Sardinia and the Spanish coast, one facing east toward the Adriatic and Greece, and a growing awareness that the sea, which it had previously treated as a boundary, was actually a highway. The First Punic War, fought against the maritime empire of Carthage beginning in 264 BCE, was in some ways Rome's introduction to serious naval warfare, and the Romans approached it with characteristic pragmatism. They were, at the start, a land power. They had no significant naval tradition. Carthage, on the other hand, had been a maritime power for centuries, with professional sailors and sophisticated warships and intimate knowledge of Mediterranean navigation. The Romans solved this problem in a way that is characteristically Roman. They cheated, or rather, they innovated. According to ancient sources, when Rome captured a Carthaginian warship early in the war, Roman shipbuilders used it as template and built a fleet of 120 warships in 60 days, a feat of industrial production that was, even allowing for ancient exaggeration, genuinely remarkable. They then added to these ships a device that transformed naval warfare. The corvees, a heavy boarding ramp with a spike at its end that could be dropped onto an enemy ship's deck, pinning the 2 vessels together and turning a sea battle into a land battle. Rome was good at land battles. Rome trained its crews to fight like legionaries, not like sailors. The corvus played to Roman strengths and neutralized Carthaginian skill. It worked. Rome won the First Punic War, the final defeat of Carthage in 146 BCE, and the almost incomprehensibly complete destruction of that city, which was levelled to its foundations and its site cursed, left Rome without a serious rival in the Western Mediterranean. The sea was becoming, in fact as well as ambition, Roman. And Rome responded to this new reality with characteristic energy, building the infrastructure that a maritime empire required. Ostia, the port city at the mouth of the Tiber was expanded into one of the great harbours of the ancient world. The Emperor Claudius added an entirely new harbour basin north of Ostia in the 1st century CE, the Portus Claudi, which was further improved by Trajan into a hexagonal inner harbour of extraordinary engineering sophistication visible in satellite images to this day as a faint hexagonal outline in the landscape south of Rome's modern airport at Fiumicino. Portus, as it was called, could handle ships far larger than the Tiber could accommodate. The grain ships that brought Egypt's harvest to Rome, enormous vessels, some of them carrying hundreds of tons of cargo, could dock at Portus and transfer their cargo to smaller river barges for the 20-kilometre journey up the Tiber to the city. The logistics of feeding a city of 1 million people in the ancient world were, by any measure, staggering. The Roman state maintained a grain dole, the annona, that provided free or subsidized grain to perhaps 200,000 citizens. The ships that carried that grain sailed from Alexandria and Carthage and Sicily and Syria, converging on the Italian coast, navigating into Portus, offloading their cargo into vast warehouses, horea, that lined the harbour on all sides. Inscriptions found at Portus record the names of guilds of grain merchants, ship captains, stevedores, and customs officials. It was a world in miniature, organised entirely around the movement of food across the sea. The Roman road network, the most famous infrastructure achievement of the ancient world, is often described as if it were entirely a land-based system, and it is the land roads that survive most visibly in the archaeological record, their straight lines cutting across the landscape from Britain to Mesopotamia. But the roads were always complementary to the sea, not a replacement for it. Heavy goods, grain, wine, olive oil, building stone, moved by sea whenever possible, because sea transport was cheaper than overland transport by an enormous margin. The roads moved armies, messengers, and relatively light cargo. The sea moved everything else. A Roman merchant with a choice between sending a cargo of amphoras of olive oil overland from Spain to Rome or loading them onto a ship at a Spanish port would choose the ship every time, because the sea journey cost perhaps 1/50th of the overland journey in transport expenses, even accounting for the risk of storms and shipwreck. The wreck of a Roman merchant ship found off the coast of the French Riviera in the 1960s, the Grand Conglou wreck, contained more than 3,000 amphoras of wine, all of them from a single estate in Campania. That quantity of wine in a single ship, travelling from one port to another in a single voyage. The scale of Roman maritime commerce was not equalled again in the Mediterranean until well into the medieval period, and the reason for it was the same reason Greek trade had flourished in the Aegean. The sea was there, it was relatively calm for much of the year, it connected places that would otherwise be impossibly far apart, and the civilization that understood how to use it could grow in ways that a purely land-based civilization could not. When Rome began to fracture in the 3rd and 4th centuries, CE, the fracture lines ran partly along geographical and partly along political lines, but they also ran along maritime lines. The Western Empire, centred on the Italian peninsula and lacking direct access to the great grain-producing regions of Egypt and North Africa, was more vulnerable to food supply disruption than the Eastern Empire, which sat astride the trade routes between Europe and Asia and controlled the Bosphorus, the strait through which Black Sea grain moved westward. Constantinople, built by the Emperor Constantine in 330 CE on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, was placed at that strait with what can only be described as geographic genius. It commanded the waterway. It sat at the junction of the maritime trade routes between Black Sea and Mediterranean, between Europe and Asia. It was impregnable from the land and could be supplied by sea almost indefinitely. When the Western Empire fell in 476 CE, the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, continued for another 1,000 years, sustained in no small part by its control of that single narrow strait of water and by the harbour it had built to take advantage of it. We will return to Constantinople. But first, we need to follow the sea in a different direction. Most people who have heard of the Silk Road imagine it as a road, or rather as a series of roads, caravan tracks threading through mountain passes and across Central Asian steppes, connecting China to Rome via a chain of oases and trading cities. Samarkand, Kashgar, Merv, Palmyra. The names are romantic and the image is powerful. Strings of camels moving through the dust laden with silk and spices, moving slowly from east to west across the most challenging terrain on earth. This image is real. Those caravans existed, and the Overland Silk Road was a genuine and important artery of ancient and medieval trade. But there was another Silk Road, and it was older, and in many periods it was larger, and it moved not through the dust of Central Asian deserts but across the surface of the Indian Ocean. It was a maritime network connecting the ports of East Africa, Arabia, India, Southeast Asia and China, and it was held together not by roads or bridges or any kind of physical infrastructure, but by something much older and more reliable, the monsoon winds. The monsoon is a wind system driven by the differential heating of land and ocean. In summer, the Asian continent heats up faster than the Indian Ocean, and air flows from the cooler ocean onto the hotter land, bringing with it moisture from the sea, the summer monsoon, which is the source of South Asia's annual rains. In winter, the continent cools faster than the ocean, and the wind reverses, blowing from the land toward the sea, the dry winter monsoon. For sailors in the Indian Ocean, these alternating seasonal winds were the most valuable natural phenomenon on Earth. A ship leaving Arabia in November could ride the northeast winter, monsoon eastward to India in a few weeks. A ship leaving India in June could ride the southwest summer monsoon westward back to Arabia. The ocean had a timetable, and if you knew the timetable, you could navigate it as reliably as a modern ferry schedule. The Greek sailor Hippolus is traditionally credited in ancient sources with the discovery of the monsoon route around the 1st century BCE, but this is almost certainly a Greek-centric retelling of a much older story. Arab, Indian, and possibly African sailors had been using the monsoon winds for centuries before any Greek text mentions them. What Hippolus may actually have done is bring knowledge of the route to a wider Mediterranean audience, contributing to the explosion of Greco-Roman trade with India that characterises the 1st century CE. The Roman historian Strabo mentions that, in his time, as many as 120 ships a year were departing from the Red Sea port of Myos Hormuz for India, 120 ships a year, each of them carrying Roman gold and silver outward, and returning laden with pepper, cinnamon, cotton, pearls, and in some cases Chinese silk that had made its way to India via the overland routes before being transshipped onto the ocean system. The ports that anchored this network were among the most cosmopolitan places in the ancient world. Muzaris, on the southwestern coast of India, the exact location is still debated, though most scholars place it near modern Kodungalur in Kerala, was described in ancient Tamil poetry as a place where the Yavanas, meaning Greeks or Romans, arrived with ships full of gold and left with ships full of pepper. Baragaza, on the Gulf of Kambat, modern Bharuch in Gujarat, was a port where goods from the entire Indian subcontinent converged before being loaded onto ships for the westward passage. The harbour at Baragaza was notoriously dangerous. The tidal bore in the Gulf of Kambat is one of the strongest in the world, and ancient sources describe the pilots who specialised in guiding ships through it as some of the most skilled and highly paid professionals of the maritime world. On the African side of this network sat the cities of the Swahili coast, a string of trading settlements on the East African shoreline, from what is now Somalia southward to Mozambique, that had been trading with Arabia and India for centuries before Europeans were aware that Africa extended so far south. The name Swahili comes from an Arabic word meaning of the coast, and it captures something essential about these cities. They were coastal places, oriented toward the sea, whose identity was shaped by the maritime trade that passed through them. Cities like Kilwa, Mombasa, Malindi, Zanzibar, later famous in the age of European exploration, but already ancient by the time Vasco da Gama arrived in the 1490s, had been importing Persian ceramics, Indian cotton, and Chinese porcelain for hundreds of years, and exporting gold, ivory, iron, and enslaved people northward and eastward. The Chinese porcelain found in the ruins of Kilwa and other Swahili coast cities is one of the most eloquent pieces of evidence for the reach of the Indian Ocean trading network. This porcelain was made in kilns in southern China and carried by sea, sometimes by Chinese ships, more often by Arab or Indian intermediaries, all the way to the East African coast, a journey of perhaps 8,000 kilometres by sea. The people of Kilwa wanted it. They valued it. They incorporated it into their domestic life and their displays of status. And the sea made it possible, not the road, the sea. The greatest of all the Indian Ocean trading cities was, without question, Calicut, the city on the Malabar coast of southwestern India that later gave its name to the fabric calico. Calicut in the 14th and 15th centuries was perhaps the most important spice market in the world. It was where the pepper from the hills of Kerala, the cinnamon from Sri Lanka, the cardamom and ginger from the Western Ghats, all came together and were sorted and weighed and loaded onto ships bound for Arabia, from where they travelled to Egypt, and then on to Venice and Genoa and Barcelona and the markets of Europe. The spice trade was the single most profitable commerce in the medieval world, and Calicut sat at its centre. When Vasco da Gama arrived there in 1498 after rounding the Cape of Good Hope, the first European to reach India by sea, the Zamorin of Calicut, the city's ruler, received him politely but was not impressed. He had been receiving foreign merchants for centuries. What was one more? The city of Aden, at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula where the Red Sea meets the Indian Ocean, was the pivot of the entire system, the place where goods from India and East Africa passed through on their way to Egypt and the Mediterranean, and where goods from the Mediterranean world arrived before being distributed eastward and southward. Aden's harbour is one of the finest natural harbours on the Arabian coast, sheltered by volcanic cliffs, deep enough for large ships, and positioned at the exact point where the monsoon routes from east and west converge. The city has been continuously inhabited for at least 2,500 years, and for most of that time it has been one of the wealthiest places on earth, because every piece of commerce between Asia and Europe that moved by sea passed through its hands, or through the hands of the Arab merchants who worked the routes on either side of it. The Arab maritime tradition that sustained this network was one of the great unsung achievements of maritime history. Arab sailors developed the lateen sail, the triangular sail that allows a ship to sail at an angle to the wind, dramatically increasing navigational flexibility, which was adopted by Mediterranean sailors and eventually found its way to the caravels of the Portuguese. They developed sophisticated celestial navigation techniques, using the stars to determine latitude with an accuracy that Europeans would not match for centuries. They built the dhow, the wooden sailing vessel with its distinctive curved hull and lateen rig, well adapted to the Indian Ocean's conditions, that remained the basic working vessel of the Western Indian Ocean until the mid-20th century. And they wrote and preserved navigational manuals, books of sailing directions listing landmarks, depths, currents, and seasonal wind patterns that accumulated knowledge across generations and made the Indian Ocean one of the best understood bodies of water in the pre-modern world. Ahmad ibn Majid, the 15th century Arab navigator who guided Vasco da Gama from Malindi on the East African coast to Calicut, was the inheritor of this tradition. He was a prolific writer on navigation who composed dozens of texts on celestial navigation, ocean currents, and coastal geography, and he was regarded by his contemporaries as one of the greatest navigators alive. Whether he understood what he was doing when he helped the Portuguese reach India, whether he grasped that in opening this sea route to Europeans he was contributing to the eventual disruption of the entire Arab-dominated Indian Ocean trading system, is a question that history does not answer. But the episode is a reminder that the great maritime routes of the pre-modern world were not things that Europeans discovered. They were things that other people had built and maintained and navigated for centuries, and that Europeans, in the age of exploration, found their way into. The sea was not empty. It was already full of commerce, and full of the cities that commerce had built. In the popular imagination, the Vikings are raiders, helmeted warriors leaping from longships onto defenceless monastic shores, carrying off gold and burning everything they could not carry. This is not entirely wrong. The raids happened, and they were violent, and the terror they spread through coastal communities in Europe during the 9th and 10th centuries was real and well documented. But the image of the Viking as pure predator misses something essential about who these people were and what they actually accomplished. The Vikings were, before anything else, the greatest navigators and mariners that Europe had produced since the Romans lost the sea. They were sailors of extraordinary skill and audacity, operating boats that were masterpieces of pre-industrial engineering, navigating oceans that no northern European had dared to cross before, and they founded cities. Many of the cities that now define the urban landscape of northern and western Europe began as Viking settlements, or were transformed by Viking trade. The longship itself deserves a moment of genuine appreciation. It was built from overlapping strakes of oak, a technique called clinker construction, that created a hull flexible enough to flex with the waves rather than being shattered by them. Exactly the property you want in a vessel crossing the North Atlantic, where the waves can be enormous and unpredictable. The hull was shallow, designed to draft only a metre or so of water, which meant the longship could not only navigate the open sea but could be rowed up rivers, beached on any gently sloping shore, and portaged overland between river systems. This versatility was the key to Viking mobility. They were not limited to coastlines and harbours. They could go anywhere water flowed, which in northern Europe and Russia meant almost anywhere at all. The river routes that the Vikings used to penetrate into the heart of Europe and Asia are known in the historical literature as the Varangian routes, and they represent one of the most audacious pieces of geographical exploration in the medieval world. From their home ports in Scandinavia, Viking traders and warriors, the Varangians, as the Byzantines and Slavs called them, sailed to the eastern shore of the Baltic Sea, rowed up the rivers of what is now Estonia and Latvia and Russia, portaged their boats over the watershed between the Baltic and the Volga and Dnieper river systems, and then floated southward on those great rivers toward the Black Sea and the Caspian. At the end of these river roads sat two of the greatest cities on earth, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and the great Abbasid cities of the Middle East, accessible from the Caspian via the Volga trade route. The Vikings called Constantinople Miklagard, the great city, and they visited it for trade, for service as mercenaries in the Byzantine Imperial Guard, and occasionally for attempts at conquest that invariably failed because Constantinople's defences were simply impregnable to anything the Vikings could bring against them. The Byzantine emperors found the Varangians useful as soldiers. They were large, fierce, loyal to their pay rather than to any local political faction, and utterly reliable in a crisis, and the Varangian Guard became one of the most famous elite military units in the medieval world. Harald Hardrada, who later became King of Norway and died at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, served in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople as a young man and rose to a senior position in it before returning north with a fortune in Byzantine gold. Along the Russian river routes, the Vikings did not merely pass through, they settled, and their settlements became cities. The founding myth of Russia's oldest cities is inseparable from the Viking presence. Novgorod, whose name means new city in Russian, was established as a trading post at the northern end of the river, routes where merchants from Scandinavia could exchange furs and amber and enslaved people for the silver and silk and spices that came northward from the south. Kiev, now the capital of Ukraine, grew up along the Dnieper as the principal Viking trading post along the river's southern course, and the dynasty that ruled it, the Rurikids, named for the semi-legendary Viking chieftain Rurik, gave their name to the political entity that historians call Kievan Rus, the predecessor of the modern Russian and Ukrainian states. The Viking rivers planted the seeds of empires. In the west, the Viking impact on cities was different but equally profound. The longships arrived on the coast of Ireland in 795 CE and almost immediately began establishing bases. Not just raiding camps, but permanent settlements with harbours, markets, and the beginnings of urban life. Dublin, which would become one of the most important cities in the British Isles, began as a Viking longfort, a fortified harbour camp established at a natural sheltered position on the River Liffey, where the river could be crossed at low tide and where the harbour was deep enough for longships. The Irish name for the settlement was Dublin, meaning black pool, referring to a dark tidal pool where the river Poddle met the Liffey. The Vikings called it Dyflin. They built it up, traded from it, raided from it, and defended it against Irish kings who periodically drove them out and then found that the trading post was too valuable to leave abandoned. Dublin kept getting refounded because its position was too good to leave empty. Waterford, Cork, Limerick, Wexford. All of the major ports of the Irish coast were established or substantially developed by the Vikings, and all of them were chosen for the same reasons: sheltered harbours, proximity to rivers that penetrated the interior, deep enough water for Viking ships. The pattern is strikingly consistent because the Vikings were consistent in their site selection criteria. They were sailors, and they thought like sailors. They saw a coastline and immediately assessed it for harbours. They saw a river and immediately assessed it for depth, current, and how far upstream they could go. They founded their cities where the nautical logic demanded that cities be founded, and those choices have persisted across 1,000 years. York, known to the Vikings as Jorvik, was transformed during the period of Viking settlement in the 9th and 10th centuries from a relatively modest post-Roman town into one of the largest and most commercially active cities in England. Excavations in the Coppergate area of York in the 1970s and 1980s revealed a Viking Age streetscape of extraordinary completeness. Wooden buildings with wattle and daub walls, workshops where craftsmen worked in amber, jet, antler, and leather. Cesspits full of the organic remains of Viking Age diet, lice combs, textile tools, and the boots and belts and everyday objects of people who'd been dead for 1,000 years. Jorvik was a manufacturing and trading city as much as it was a military base. It sat on the Uist River, connected by water to the Humber estuary, and thence to the North Sea, the Viking Highway. Goods moved in and out of Jorvik by water. Merchants from Dublin and from the continent and from Scandinavia came to Jorvik's markets. It was a port city in every meaningful sense, despite being 50 kilometres from the sea. In Normandy, whose very name means land of the Northmen, the Viking settlers who received the region from the Frankish king in 911 CE adopted the French language and French customs, but retained the maritime orientation that was in their cultural DNA. The Norman ports facing the English Channel became among the most commercially active in northern Europe, and the Normans themselves became, in the 11th century, one of the most aggressively expansionist peoples in the medieval world. Not just in England, where the conquest of 1066 is the famous episode, but in Sicily, in southern Italy, in the Levant during the Crusades. The Normans went where ships could take them, and ships could take them almost anywhere. Their ancestor Rollo, who received Normandy from the Frankish king, was a Viking who had spent his career raiding the coastlines of Europe by sea. His descendants ruled England, Sicily, and parts of the Holy Land. The sea carried them there. The Norse discovery of North America, real, documented, predating Columbus by 5 centuries, is the most dramatic expression of the Viking relationship with the sea. Leif Erikson, following up on reports from the trader Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had sighted but not landed on the North American coast, led an expedition from Greenland westward around 1000 CE and established a settlement at a place he called Vinland. The site at Lanceau Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland, excavated in the 1960s and now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is the confirmed archaeological evidence of that settlement. The Norse were in North America 500 years before Columbus. They built houses there. They worked iron there. They apparently had contact with the indigenous peoples, not always peaceful contact according to the sagas. And then they left, because the settlement was not sustainable without the kind of naval resupply line that could bridge 5,000 kilometres of the North Atlantic, and because the Greenland colony itself was too small and too fragile to sustain the venture. But the attempt tells you everything you need to know about what the Viking relationship to water meant. To a Viking, the North Atlantic was not an obstacle. It was a road, an uncomfortable road, a dangerous road, one that demanded extraordinary skill and endurance and courage to travel, but a road nonetheless. And roads lead to cities. The cities at the end of the Viking roads are still there. Dublin and York, and Novgorod and Kiev, cities born from the longships, are still cities today, still sitting beside their rivers and their harbours, still benefiting from the geographical logic that the Vikings recognised 1,000 years ago. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE did not immediately destroy the cities that Rome had built or fostered. It disrupted them, it reduced them, it cut them off from the supply chains and administrative networks that had sustained them. The population of Rome itself, which may have reached 1 million people at its peak in the 2nd century CE, fell to perhaps 30,000 by the 6th century, a collapse so dramatic that the city's aqueducts fell into disrepair, its forums were used as cattle pastures, and the Colosseum became a quarry for building stone. But the cities did not entirely disappear, and the ones that survived, and in time recovered and grew, were, almost without exception, the ones that sat beside water. London is an instructive case. The Roman city of Londinium had been founded around 50 CE at the point on the Thames, where the river was wide enough to be a natural highway for ocean-going ships, but narrow enough to be bridged, an ideal location that the Romans recognised immediately. The Roman bridge across the Thames, London Bridge, fixed the city's position as the lowest bridging point on the river, and everything upstream of that bridge became accessible by boat from the sea. When the Roman administration withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, Londinium contracted sharply. Archaeological evidence suggests the city was largely abandoned for much of the 5th and 6th centuries, its streets reverting to grassland, its buildings crumbling. But the location had too much geographical logic to remain empty. By the 7th century, a new Anglo-Saxon settlement had grown up just to the west of the old Roman walls, a trading settlement focused on the river called Lundenwic by its inhabitants. The merchants were back. The river had brought them back. The Norman conquest of 1066 accelerated London's recovery and growth enormously. William the Conqueror immediately recognised the city's strategic and commercial importance and built the Tower of London on the river's bank, both to defend the city and, perhaps more importantly, to control it. The Norman kings extended and regularised the city's trading privileges, and London quickly became the primary commercial centre of England, a position it has held with brief interruptions ever since. The Thames made this possible. Ships from France, from the Low Countries, from the Baltic and the Mediterranean could sail directly into the river and unload their cargo at the city's quays. The river was the reason for London's existence, the source of its wealth, and the foundation of its eventual transformation into the capital of a global empire. Paris tells a parallel story, though with a different accent. The original, Gaulish settlement on the Ile de la Cité, the island in the Seine that remains the geographical heart of the French capital, was chosen because islands in rivers are inherently defensible without being disconnected from both riverbanks. The Romans built their city of Lutetia on and round this island, and when Roman power faded, the Frankish kings who succeeded them kept their court nearby, finding the river island's strategic advantages as compelling as the Romans had. Paris grew outward from the Seine in both directions, adding bridges and quays and markets along the riverbank, and the right bank, the northern bank of the Seine, which was the sunniest and most accessible, became the commercial heart of the city, while the left bank, cooler and more removed, became the intellectual and ecclesiastical centre, home to the University of Paris and the great Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. The Seine was Paris's highway to the sea. Goods from Normandy and Britain arrived by river. Wine from Burgundy and the Loire Valley floated downstream on barges, The core of water merchants, the marchands de l'eau, who controlled river navigation within the city, were one of the most powerful guilds in medieval Paris, and their symbol, a ship, eventually became the emblem of the city itself, still visible on Paris's coat of arms today. Fluctuat nec mergitur, tossed but not sunk, is the city's motto, and it is a sailor's motto, chosen by a city that has always understood itself as a creature of its river. Hamburg sits at the point where the Ulster, a small tributary, joins the Elbe River about 100 kilometres from the North Sea. It was not a natural harbour in the way that a coastal city might be, and its early history is unremarkable, a small fortified settlement frequently contested between local powers. What transformed Hamburg into one of the great port cities of Europe was the Elbe, and the access that the Elbe gave to the interior of northern Germany, and the access that the North Sea gave to the trading networks of Scandinavia, Britain, and eventually the Baltic. Hamburg joined the Hanseatic League, the great trading confederation of northern European port cities that dominated Baltic and North Sea commerce from the 13th to the 17th century, and through the League gained access to markets from London to Novgorod. The Hanseatic League itself is one of the most fascinating political and commercial phenomena in European history. It was not a state. It had no monarch, no parliament, no army worthy of the name. It was a network of merchant cities, Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, Rostock, Stralsund, Danzig, Riga, and dozens of others, that agreed to standardize their trade practices, defend each other's commercial interests, and operate trading posts called contours in foreign cities. There was a contour in London, the Steelyard on the north bank of the Thames, and one in Bergen and one in Bruges and one in Novgorod. These trading posts were, in effect, small colonies of Hanseatic merchants living within foreign cities, operating by their own rules, maintaining their own warehouses and dormitories and chapels, speaking German in an English or Norwegian or Flemish city, and conducting the commerce that enriched their home ports. What held the Hansa together was not law or government, but the sea and the common interest of the sea-trading cities. They needed safe passage through the Baltic. They needed the right to trade in each other's ports without punitive tariffs. They needed reliable weights and measures and contract law that their trading partners would honour. They needed, in short, the infrastructure of commerce, and they built it themselves, because the sea gave them the means and the motive to do so. The Hansa lasted for roughly 4 centuries as a meaningful commercial entity, and the cities it enriched are, to this day, among the most prosperous in northern Europe. Hamburg is the second largest city in Germany. Bremen is a city-state in its own right. Lübeck gave Thomas Mann his greatest novel. These are port cities, made by the sea. Further south, in the valley of the Rhine, one of the great river highways of European history, city after city grew up at points where the river offered advantages: a ford, a narrowing that made bridging easy, a tributary junction that made the place a natural node in the trading network, a rocky spur that made defence straightforward. Cologne sits at the northernmost point where the Rhine emerges from its rocky upper gorge and spreads across the flatter lowlands, making it the natural gateway between the Rhine's upper trading communities and the North Sea. It was a Roman city, Colonia Agrippinensis, named for the Emperor Claudius's wife who was born there, and it grew rich as a trading city through the medieval period, becoming one of the largest cities in northern Europe. Its great cathedral, rising above the Rhine as a landmark visible for miles. Mainz, Koblenz, Worms, Strasbourg, all of them Rhine cities, all of them shaped by the river that connected them to each other and to the world. The pattern repeats itself with monotonous and beautiful consistency across the whole of medieval Europe. Follow any major river on a medieval map and you will find the cities threaded along it like beads on a string. Follow the rivers to where they meet the sea, and you will find the great ports. The sea and the rivers were the arteries, and the cities were the organs that those arteries sustained, complex, vital, necessary, and always, always near the water. There are cities that seem inevitable, placed at mountain passes, river crossings, or natural harbours as if geography were pointing to them and saying, yes, here, obviously here. And then there is Venice. Venice is a city that should not exist. It was built on a cluster of mudflats and small islands in a lagoon at the northwestern corner of the Adriatic Sea, in a location that offered virtually no natural resources, no agricultural land, no strategic defensive advantage that a dozen other locations might not have equalled or surpassed. The water that made Venice was not a great river carrying fertile silt, not a deep harbour sheltering ocean-going ships, but a shallow, difficult tide-swept lagoon that required constant engineering to make habitable and constant dredging to keep navigable. And yet Venice became, for several centuries perhaps, the most powerful commercial city in the world. The most beautiful city in the world, many have argued, though beauty is a complicated claim, and certainly one of the most improbable cities in the world, a city built on water, in water, of water, for the sea. The origins of Venice are traditionally traced to the 5th and 6th centuries CE, when refugees from the mainland cities of northeastern Italy, Aquileia, Padua, Altino, fled to the islands of the lagoon to escape the raids of first the Visigoths, and then the Huns, and eventually the Lombards who were devastating the Italian countryside. The lagoon offered safety that the mainland could not. The shallow waters that made navigation difficult for large armies were manageable for the small, flat-bottomed boats that the islanders learned to use. The tides that swept in and out twice daily kept the lagoon's waters relatively clean, and the fish, the extraordinary abundance of fish in the lagoon and in the Adriatic beyond it, provided food that the settlers could not grow but did not need to. The earliest Venetians were fishermen and then salt makers. The lagoon environment was ideal for salt production, and salt in the early medieval period was one of the most economically critical commodities in existence. It was the primary means of food preservation in a world without refrigeration, and its production was limited to a relatively small number of geographical locations. Venice's salt gave it its first commodity to trade, and trading meant ships, and ships meant knowledge of the sea, and knowledge of the sea was the foundation on which everything that followed was built. The Byzantine Empire, which controlled the northeastern Adriatic in the early medieval period, found Venice to be a useful ally, largely autonomous, technically under Byzantine sovereignty, and possessed of a fleet and seamanship that the empire could use. In exchange for naval service and political loyalty, the Byzantine emperors granted the Venetians trading privileges in the empire's ports that gave Venetian merchants competitive advantages unavailable to their rivals. These privileges were periodically renewed and expanded, and each renewal deepened Venice's commercial penetration of the Byzantine commercial system. By the 9th century, Venetian merchants were trading throughout the eastern Mediterranean, in Constantinople, in Alexandria, in the ports of the Levant. By the 10th century, they were the dominant commercial presence in the eastern Mediterranean, with warehouses and trading communities in every major port. The Rialto, the island at the heart of the Venetian archipelago where the Grand Canal makes its famous S-bend, became the commercial centre of this enterprise. The Rialto market, established in the 11th century, was for several centuries one of the most important financial and commercial centres in the world. Banking, insurance, commodity trading, foreign exchange, the financial instruments that would eventually define the modern economy, were developed or substantially refined at the Rialto. The bill of exchange, a written order to pay a specified sum at a specified future date, which allowed merchants to conduct international trade without carrying large amounts of cash across dangerous roads, was in widespread use in Venice centuries before it became common elsewhere. Marine insurance, contracts under which an insurer agreed to compensate a merchant for cargo lost at sea in exchange for a premium payment, was institutionalized in Venice in the 14th century. These are not merely interesting historical footnotes. They are the foundations of modern commerce, and they were invented by people whose entire economy was organized around maritime trade. The Arsenal of Venice, the enormous shipbuilding complex on the eastern edge of the city, was the first large-scale industrial production facility in European history. At its peak, in the 15th and 16th centuries, the arsenal employed some 16,000 workers and could, according to contemporary accounts, complete and outfit a fully armed merchant galley in a single day. The production line, raw materials entering at one end, finished ships emerging at the other, was described by visitors as something extraordinary, something that no other city in the world could match. The poet Dante visited the arsenal and was so struck by its noise and activity and infernal atmosphere that he used it as the inspiration for one of the circles of hell in the Inferno. Shipbuilding as hell is perhaps an apt metaphor given the heat and smoke and continuous physical labour involved. But the ships that the arsenal produced were the instruments of Venetian power, and without them, nothing about Venice's extraordinary story was possible. The Fourth Crusade of 1202 to 1204 is Venice's most controversial episode. The moment when the crusading army, having contracted with Venice to transport them to the Holy Land, found itself unable to pay the agreed price and ended up, through a combination of Venetian manipulation and crusader opportunism, attacking and sacking Constantinople, the greatest Christian city on earth, instead of fighting the Muslims in Palestine. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was a catastrophe for the Byzantine Empire, from which it never fully recovered. For Venice, it was a bonanza. The treaty that followed gave Venice control of 3/8 of the Byzantine Empire's territory, the islands and ports and coastlines that controlled the trade routes of the eastern Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire was dismembered, and Venice walked away with the arteries. The bronze horses of San Marco, those magnificent, impossibly graceful sculptures that stand above the entrance to the Basilica di San Marco in Venice, their hooves raised as if in motion, their bronze bodies gleaming in the Adriatic light, were taken from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. They had stood in the hippodrome of Constantinople, possibly for centuries before that in Rome, possibly for centuries before that in Greece. Their origin is unknown, their age is disputed. They may be the oldest surviving large-scale bronzes in the world, and they stand now in Venice. Well, casts of them stand outside, while the originals are preserved inside from the weather, as the most visible symbol of Venice's extraordinary centuries of maritime power and maritime looting. Every time you look at those horses, you are looking at the proceeds of one of the most audacious commercial enterprises in European history. The slow decline of Venice, beginning in the late 15th century, was driven by the sea in the same way that its rise had been. When Vasco da Gama rounded Africa and reached India in 1498, he opened an ocean route to the spice markets that had been Venice's commercial foundation. The spices now moved not through Alexandria and Constantinople and Venice, but around Africa to Lisbon, and then to the ports of the Atlantic coast. Venice's geographical advantage, its position at the end of the Mediterranean trade routes, became a geographical liability when the trade routes shifted to the ocean. The city did not disappear, and it did not even quickly decline. It remained one of the most prosperous cities in Italy for another century after the Portuguese opened their route. But the world had moved, and Venice, fixed to its lagoon, could not move with it. What Venice left behind was not merely beautiful buildings and art, though the buildings and art are extraordinary. It left behind a template for how a maritime commercial city could organise itself, finance itself, govern itself, and project power through trade rather than conquest. The Venetian Republic lasted 1,000 years, which is longer than almost any other political entity in the Western world. It was governed by merchants, for merchants, in the interests of commerce and the sea. And while that sounds cynical, the result was something genuinely remarkable, a city that built itself out of water and wood and salt and silk and the wind on the Adriatic, and became, for a few centuries, the most sophisticated urban civilization in the world. There is a narrow waterway in northwestern Turkey, connecting the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, that is roughly 30 kilometres long and less than a kilometre wide at its narrowest point. Ships pass through it so close to the shore that passengers on cruise liners can look directly into the windows of apartment buildings on the hillside. In the 4th century BCE, the Persian king Darius built a bridge of boats across it to move his army into Europe. In the early 20th century, the military campaign to control it cost the lives of 500,000 soldiers. Today, roughly 50,000 ships pass through it every year, carrying oil and grain and manufactured goods between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It is called the Bosphorus, and no other waterway on Earth has been more continuously and completely strategic for more of human history. On the European side of the Bosphorus, at the point where the strait opens into the Sea of Marmara, there is a triangular peninsula bounded on one side by the strait itself, on another by a deep natural inlet called the Golden Horn, and on the third by the open sea. This peninsula is the most defensible position in the entire region, naturally protected on 3 sides by water, requiring only a single land wall across the base of the triangle to be essentially impregnable. The Greeks recognized this in the 7th century BCE, when they founded a colony there called Byzantium. The Romans recognized it when they built their eastern capital there in 330 CE and called it Constantinople. And the Ottomans recognized it when they conquered it in 1453 and made it the capital of the greatest empire the Islamic world had yet produced. Constantine, the Roman emperor who moved the empire's capital from Rome to Byzantium and renamed it Constantinople, the city of Constantine, was making a strategic calculation that was also a maritime calculation. Rome sat in the western Mediterranean, far from the empire's richest provinces and most dangerous frontiers. Constantinople sat at the junction of Europe and Asia, controlling the strait that was the only passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, surrounded by water on 3 sides, positioned to dominate the trade routes that moved between east and west and between north and south. It was, in a word, perfect, and it proved its perfection by surviving, while Rome fell, and while the Western Empire fractured, and while barbarian kingdoms divided Italy and France and Spain among themselves. Constantinople endured, partly through military effectiveness, partly through wealth, partly through the extraordinary strength of the Theodosian walls that the Emperor Theodosius II built across the landward side of the peninsula in the early 5th century, but partly, significantly, through the Bosphorus itself. No enemy fleet could pass from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean without passing Constantinople's harbour guns. No enemy army could besiege the city completely as long as the sea remained accessible for supply ships. The water was the wall that no enemy could breach. For 1,000 years, Constantinople was the richest city in Christendom, arguably the richest city in the world. Its population may have reached 600,000 at its peak in the 6th century under the Emperor Justinian, a time when Rome had perhaps 30,000 inhabitants and Paris perhaps 20,000. It was the terminus of the Silk Road in its overland form, the destination of the caravans that crossed Central Asia from China. It was the market where silk and spices and precious stones from the east met the gold and silver and amber and furs from the north and west. The Hagia Sophia, the great church built by Justinian in the 6th century, whose dome was the largest in the world for nearly 1,000 years and remains one of the most extraordinary architectural achievements in human history, was not merely a religious building. It was a statement about what Constantinople was, the centre of the civilized world, the place where heaven and earth met, the city that controlled the passage between seas. The Golden Horn, the deep natural inlet on the northern side of the city, was Constantinople's harbour, and it was protected by a great chain that could be stretched across its entrance to prevent enemy ships from entering. The chain was made of enormous iron links, each one nearly a metre long, suspended on wooden floats. When the chain was up, the harbour was closed. When it was down, the fleet of the empire could deploy. The chain is first mentioned in sources from the 7th century, and it was in use for most of the period between then and the city's fall in 1453. It failed on one notable occasion. In 1453, when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, unable to force the chain, had his fleet physically dragged overland on greased wooden rollers around the hill of Galata on the northern shore and launched into the Golden Horn behind the chain. It was a piece of military engineering as audacious as anything in history, and it worked. The harbour was breached, and within days the city fell. Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror as he became known, was 21 years old when he took Constantinople, and his understanding of the city's importance was immediate and complete. He did not sack it in the way that cities were normally sacked, reducing it to rubble and slaughter. He walked into the Hagia Sophia on the day of the conquest, and had it declared a mosque. He invited the Greek population that had fled to return. He recruited scholars and craftsmen and merchants of all religions and backgrounds to repopulate and rebuild the city. He understood, with the clarity of genuine strategic intelligence, that Constantinople was valuable precisely because it was a city, a functioning, complex, cosmopolitan commercial and administrative centre, and that burning it would be destroying the thing he had just worked so hard to take. The city he renamed Istanbul. Though the change of name was gradual, official Ottoman documents continued to call it Constantinia for centuries, became the capital of the Ottoman Empire at the peak of its power. The empire stretched at its greatest extent from the borders of Morocco to the shores of the Persian Gulf, from the gates of Vienna to the highlands of Yemen. Its sultan was simultaneously the ruler of the most powerful military state in the world, and the caliph of Sunni Islam, the successor to the prophet in temporal power. And the centre of all of this was the city on the Bosphorus. The Topkapi Palace, built by Mehmed on the tip of the peninsula, looked out over the junction of the Bosphorus, the Golden Horn, and the Sea of Marmara. 3 different bodies of water visible from the same vantage point, a constant visual reminder of the maritime geography that made the city what it was. The Bosphorus Strait in the Ottoman period was not merely a strategic asset. It was the city's food supply, its commercial lifeline, its connection to the Black Sea provinces whose grain fed Istanbul's enormous population. The Ottomans maintained a fleet of grain ships to ensure that supplies from the Black Sea coast reached the city continuously, and the disruption of this supply, by storms, by piracy, by political conflict with the powers that controlled the grain-producing regions, was a recurring political crisis throughout the empire's history. The city's food security was the Bosphorus's navigability, and the Bosphorus's navigability was the empire's survival. The waterway was not just a border or a highway, it was the empire's spinal column. The Galata district on the northern side of the Golden Horn, today called Beyoğlu, was for most of the Ottoman period the city's foreign quarter, home to Genoese and later other European merchants, to the embassies of the great powers, to the churches and synagogues and non-Muslim places of worship that could not easily exist within the old city. The Galata Tower, built by the Genoese in the 14th century and surviving to this day, is a remnant of a colony that the maritime city of Genoa maintained in Constantinople for commercial purposes, a foothold in the city that controlled the passage between seas because anyone who wanted to trade with the Black Sea had to pass through Constantinople, and anyone who passed through Constantinople paid taxes to whoever sat in the Topkapi Palace. The importance of the Bosphorus has not diminished with the modern era. In the 20th century, the question of who controlled the strait and what rights foreign warships had to pass through it was one of the recurring crises of international politics. The Montreux Convention of 1936 gave Turkey sovereignty over the strait and the right to regulate military traffic through it, a right that Turkey exercised with considerable political sensitivity throughout the Cold War, when both the Soviet Union to the north and NATO to the south had urgent interests in the question of which warships could pass in which direction. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Turkey's control of the Bosphorus was once again at the centre of international diplomacy, as Turkey used the Montreux Convention to close the strait to warships of non-Black Sea states, limiting the naval response available to NATO members. The ancient waterway was still shaping the politics of great powers. The chain across the Golden Horn was gone, replaced by international treaty law, but the strategic reality it represented was exactly the same. By the middle of the 15th century, the world's maritime network had a shape that was familiar to its regular users: the Arab merchants of the Indian Ocean, the Venetian galleys of the Mediterranean, the Hanseatic cogs of the Baltic, the Chinese junks of the South China Sea. It was a world of established routes, known hazards, seasonal winds, and recognised ports. It was also, from the European perspective, a world that was both frustratingly limited and tantalising in its glimpses of what lay beyond the known edges. The spices came from somewhere in the east, but the routes to that somewhere were controlled by Arab and Ottoman intermediaries who charged dearly for the privilege of buying what they had carried. The gold came from somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, but the Sahara Desert was an almost impassable barrier to overland exploration. And beyond the western edge of the known Atlantic there was nothing, or nothing that anyone in Europe could be certain of. What changed all of this in the space of roughly 50 years between 1487 and 1522 was a combination of navigational technology, royal ambition, financial investment, and pure audacious determination that sent European ships farther from their home ports than any vessels had sailed before. Bartolomeo Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 and proved that a sea route from Europe to Asia around Africa existed. Vasco da Gama followed it to India in 1498 and proved that it could be profitably used. Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492 and found not India, but an entire hemisphere that European geography had not known existed. Ferdinand Magellan began the first circumnavigation of the globe in 1519, and though he died in the Philippines, his ship and a fragment of his crew completed it in 1522. In 50 years, the world doubled, and wherever these ships went, they looked for harbours, and where they found good harbours, they built cities. The Portuguese were the first systematic builders of what might be called the colonial port city, a settlement established not because of the natural growth of a local population around a favourable site, but because a distant, imperial power needed a secure base for its maritime operations. The Portuguese system, developed in the early 16th century, was built on a network of fortified ports called vitórias, trading posts, literally factories, scattered around the coastlines of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. They were not intended to be colonies in the later sense of the word, large settlements of European immigrants displacing local populations. They were intended to be commercial and military bases, points of control in the maritime network, places where Portuguese ships could take on water and provisions and make repairs, and where Portuguese merchants could buy and sell. Goa, on the western coast of India, was taken by the Portuguese in 1510 and became the capital of the Estado da India, the Portuguese Asian Empire. It was chosen because it had an excellent harbour, because it was located at roughly the midpoint of the western Indian coast, and because the island position of the old city gave it natural defences that the Portuguese could supplement with fortifications. For a century and a half, Goa was the greatest European city in Asia, larger than Lisbon, wealthier than almost anywhere in the Western world, its harbour crowded with ships from every part of the Indian Ocean world. The Jesuit missionary Francis Xavier, who spent years in Goa and described it extensively in his letters, called it the Rome of the East, and while this was rhetoric, it was not entirely empty rhetoric. Goa was extraordinary by any standard. It has been called the city that smelled of spices because the warehouses and trading posts along its waterfront were stacked with pepper and cinnamon and cardamom in quantities that perfumed the sea breeze for miles. Malacca, the city on the southwestern tip of the Malay Peninsula, controlling the strait between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra, was, in 1511, the most important commercial city in Southeast Asia. Its harbour sat astride the narrowest and most critical passage on the maritime route between India and China, and the rulers of Malacca collected tolls from every ship that passed through. The city had, by the early 16th century, grown into one of the most cosmopolitan places on earth. Portuguese visitors recorded that more than 80 languages were spoken in the markets of Malacca, and that merchants from China, India, Java, Siam, Burma, Arabia, Persia, and East Africa all had permanent communities there. When the Portuguese took Malacca by force in 1511, they were taking not just a city, but a maritime choke point, and they understood exactly what they had. The victory gave them control of the strait, which gave them control of the spice trade between East Asia and the Indian Ocean, which gave them, for a time, a commercial dominance over the most profitable trade routes on Earth. The Spanish model was different from the Portuguese, but built on the same maritime logic. The great Spanish colonial cities of the Americas, Havana, Cartagena, Panama City, Veracruz, Buenos Aires, Lima's port of Callao, were all chosen for their harbour qualities, their defensibility, and their position on the trade routes that connected the Americas to Spain. Havana, which became the most important port in the Spanish colonial system in the Americas, was chosen because its harbour, a large, deep, almost completely enclosed bay, accessible through a narrow channel that could be controlled by a single fortress, was one of the finest natural harbours in the Caribbean. Every Spanish treasure fleet returning from the Americas stopped at Havana to take on provisions and convoy together for the crossing to Spain, which meant that at certain times of year, Havana harbour was crowded with dozens of ships simultaneously, making it a city of extraordinary commercial activity and, inevitably, a target of extraordinary interest for pirates and rival powers. The Dutch, who entered the colonial trade in the late 16th century as a challenge to the Portuguese and Spanish empires, brought a different approach, more systematically commercial, less concerned with religious conversion or territorial control, more focused on the mechanics of profit. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, established in 1602, was the first joint stock company in history whose shares were traded on an open market, another financial innovation from the world of maritime commerce. The VOC built a network of trading posts across the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia, and the greatest of these was Batavia, built on the northern coast of Java in 1619, on the ruins of a Sundanese port called Jayakarta. Batavia, now Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, was planned as a Dutch city in the tropics. Canals, brick buildings, a town hall, a hospital, churches, and a massive warehouse complex that could store the enormous quantities of spices and other goods passing through the VOC's hands. The canals, which the Dutch builders dug in an attempt to recreate the familiar waterways of Amsterdam, turned out to be a disaster in the tropical climate. They filled with stagnant water that bred mosquitoes, and the resulting malaria epidemics killed a significant portion of Batavia's European population in the city's early decades. But the harbour worked, and the harbour was the reason Batavia existed, and the reason it grew into one of the largest cities in Asia. The founding of Buenos Aires, twice, because the first attempt in 1535 was abandoned due to conflict with indigenous peoples, and the second, permanent settlement, was established in 1580, illustrates how thoroughly the colonial city founding logic was oriented around water. Buenos Aires sits on the western bank of the Rio de la Plata, the River of Silver, the widest river in the world by some measures, at a point where ocean-going ships coming from the Atlantic could navigate far enough upstream to establish a port, but where the river was also shallow enough to cause serious navigation difficulties. The city that grew on that bank became the commercial capital of the southern part of South America, the gateway through which the agricultural and mineral produce of the Argentine interior moved to the world market. The estuary was awkward and required constant dredging to maintain navigable channels, but it was there, and it was the connection to the Atlantic, and that was enough. Buenos Aires became one of the largest cities in the world by the early 20th century, built on the water it almost didn't have. The colonial port cities created a new geography of the world, a network of nodes connected by ocean routes, replacing the older geography of overland roads and river routes as the primary organizing structure of global commerce. This new geography was violent in its creation and exploitative in its operation, built on the enslavement and extraction that defined European colonialism, but its physical legacy, the harbour cities that it created or transformed, is with us still. Mumbai, Colombo, Cape Town, Sydney, Singapore, Hong Kong, Havana, Cartagena, Montevideo, Jakarta. These are cities that exist in their current form because of the maritime trade routes of the colonial era, because a harbour was found or built in a specific location, and because the commerce that passed through that harbour attracted people and capital and institutions that eventually became the city. The water was the reason, as it had always been the reason. The colonial age just extended the reach of the reason to include the entire globe. When European settlers began pushing westward from the Atlantic coast of North America in the late 18th century, they encountered a river system of almost incomprehensible scale. The Mississippi River and its tributaries drain roughly 40% of the continental United States, an area of more than 3 million square kilometers, stretching from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachians, from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. Before the railroads came, this river system was America's highway network, its supply chain, and its commercial backbone. The cities that grew along it were not incidental to American expansion. They were its mechanism. The Mississippi itself is, to anyone who has not encountered it, a genuinely startling thing. It is not fast, and it is not spectacular in the way that mountain rivers are spectacular. It is brown and wide and inexorable, carrying an enormous burden of sediment from the heartland of a continent toward the sea, at New Orleans near its mouth. It is more than a kilometre wide and flows at a rate of perhaps 17,000 cubic metres per second in normal conditions. The river has been channeled and levied and controlled and modified by human engineering on a scale that defies easy description, but it retains something of its original character. The feeling that this is a thing of enormous power that is merely tolerating the structures that humans have built to constrain it, and that it could, if it chose to exert itself, sweep all of those structures away. The Great Mississippi Floods of 1927 and 1993 were reminders that it sometimes does choose to exert itself, with consequences that reshaped American politics and engineering in their respective eras. New Orleans was founded by the French in 1718 at a location that made geographic sense and engineering nonsense simultaneously. The site at the first good landing upstream from the mouth of the Mississippi was chosen because it was the logical place for a city controlling the river's commerce. But it was also a crescent of land barely above sea level, surrounded by swamps and marshes and a large lake on its north side, separated from the Gulf of Mexico by only a narrow barrier of sediment that the river itself had deposited over centuries. Building a city there required draining the swamps, levelling the land, building levees against the river's floods, and accepting the geological reality that the city would spend most of its history below sea level, surviving only because of the engineering structures that held the water back. The people of New Orleans have always known, at some level, that they are living by the river's permission. Hurricane Katrina in 2005, which overwhelmed the city's levee system and flooded 80% of the city's area, was not a surprise to anyone who understood the geography. It was an overdue reckoning with the terms under which New Orleans had always existed. And yet New Orleans was indispensable. For most of the 19th century, it was the largest city in the American South and one of the largest in the country. The reason was simple and absolute. It sat at the mouth of the Mississippi, and everything that came down the Mississippi passed through New Orleans on its way to the world. Cotton from the Mississippi Delta, grain from the Ohio and Illinois valleys, tobacco from Kentucky and Tennessee, sugar from the Louisiana plantations, timber from the vast forests of the upper Midwest. All of it floated down the river on flatboats in the early years, on steamboats after about 1820, to New Orleans, where it was transferred to ocean-going ships and sent to Europe and the eastern seaboard. New Orleans was the drain through which the productivity of the American interior poured into the world economy. Without it, or without something performing its function, the whole system would have been radically less efficient. The steamboat transformed the Mississippi, and made New Orleans more powerful still. Before steam, travel upstream on the Mississippi, against the current, was an arduous, expensive, sometimes impossible exercise. A flatboat coming downriver from Pittsburgh or Louisville arrived at New Orleans and was typically broken up for timber, because the cost of returning it upstream was prohibitive. The people who had come down on it either stayed in New Orleans or made their way home overland. The steamboat first successfully operated on the Mississippi by Robert Fulton's New Orleans in 1811, and quickly improved upon by a generation of designers and operators, changed this completely. A steamboat could make the round trip between New Orleans and Louisville in days where the upstream journey had previously taken weeks or months. Goods from Europe and the eastern seaboard could be shipped to New Orleans and then sent upstream by steamer to the interior cities. The river became genuinely bidirectional, and the cities along its banks grew accordingly. Cincinnati, on the Ohio River, the Mississippi's great eastern tributary, became, in the early 19th century, one of the fastest growing cities in America. It was called the Queen City of the West, and it earned the title by processing the agricultural output of the Ohio Valley, particularly pork, which was packed and shipped from Cincinnati in such quantities that the city acquired the nickname Porkopolis. The Ohio River connected Cincinnati to the Mississippi, and thence to New Orleans and the world. The city grew along the riverbank, its levees crowded with steamboats, its warehouses full of barrels of salted pork and casks of whiskey and bales of wool. By the middle of the 19th century, it had a population of over 100,000 and was the cultural centre of the American Midwest, home to a symphony orchestra, major newspapers, and a significant art scene. All of this ultimately was the river. The river made the trade possible. The trade made the city possible. St. Louis at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, the point where the Missouri, which had drained the vast interior of the continent from the Rocky Mountains eastward, joined the main stem of the Mississippi, was positioned at the most important commercial junction in the interior of North America. It was the gateway to the West in a physical as well as metaphorical sense. The Missouri River was the highway into the Great Plains and eventually the Rocky Mountains, and St. Louis was the last major city before you followed that highway into territory that, for much of the 19th century, was unmapped and largely unknown to Americans of European descent. Lewis and Clark set out from St. Louis in 1804 on the expedition that Jefferson had commissioned to explore the Missouri's course to the Pacific. They returned to St. Louis in 1806 with the first reliable map of the northwestern continent and the information that would eventually guide the fur trappers, the missionaries, the settlers, and the prospectors who came after them, all departing from St. Louis, all heading west on the river. The Hudson River in New York State tells a parallel story on a different axis. The Hudson runs from the Adirondack Mountains southward to New York Harbor, and in its early colonial period it was the highway along which Dutch and then English settlers pushed northward from the coast. But its great significance in American history is that it provided, through the Erie Canal built in 1825, the first practical water-level route across the Appalachian mountain range that separated the Atlantic coast from the interior of the continent. The Erie Canal connected the Hudson to the Great Lakes, and through the Great Lakes to the entire watershed of the upper Midwest. When the canal opened, goods from the farms of Ohio and Indiana and Illinois could travel by water all the way to New York Harbor, a journey of perhaps 10 days by canal boat and river, where the overland alternative had taken weeks and was limited by the difficulty of moving heavy loads over mountain roads. The canal made New York the primary commercial gateway of the American interior because it was the eastern end of the only practical water route across the mountains. The city that had already been the largest in America became dramatically larger, pulling ahead of Philadelphia and Boston in a way that no subsequent development was able to reverse. The great river cities of America, New Orleans, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Louisville, Memphis, Baton Rouge, were each and every one of them creatures of the water. They exist where they exist because the rivers were there, and the rivers were highways, and highways attract commerce, and commerce builds cities. When the railroads came in the 1840s and 1850s, they changed the geography somewhat. Cities that had railroad connections could grow even if their river positions were not ideal, and some river cities were bypassed by rail routes that went elsewhere. But the railroads themselves, at least initially, were built to connect to the river cities. They reinforced the water-based geography rather than replacing it. It was only in the 20th century, with the automobile and the interstate highway system, that American cities were built in locations with no particular relationship to water, and even then, the largest and most powerful American cities remained, almost without exception, the ones that the rivers and the harbours had built. In the summer of 1830, the city of Manchester was connected by a new railway to the port of Liverpool, 30 miles away on the River Mersey. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway was not the world's first railway. Horse-drawn rail lines had existed for decades in the coal mines of England, but it was the world's first railway designed to carry passengers and freight between two major cities using steam-powered locomotives, and its opening was one of the defining moments of the Industrial Revolution. 2 years later, a parliamentary committee described the Lancashire cotton industry, centred on Manchester and shipped through Liverpool, as the greatest concentration of industrial production that the world had ever seen. The railway had not replaced the port. It had extended it, linking the industrial interior of England to the deep water harbour at Liverpool that gave those manufactured goods access to the world. Liverpool's transformation in the 18th and 19th centuries from a modest market town on the Mersey estuary into one of the great ports of the world is one of the most dramatic examples of what industrial-era maritime commerce could do to a city. In 1700, Liverpool had a population of perhaps 5,000 people. By 1900, it had more than 700,000. The harbour had been rebuilt multiple times. The first wet dock in the world, the Old Dock, was built at Liverpool in 1715, a revolutionary innovation that allowed ships to float at a constant level regardless of the tide, enabling more efficient loading and unloading. The dock system expanded steadily throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, with new enclosed basins added decade by decade, until the Liverpool waterfront was an almost continuous line of docks stretching for miles along the Mersey. The dock road that ran along the waterfront was, at the height of Liverpool's commercial dominance, perhaps the busiest road in Britain, a continuous flow of horse-drawn carts carrying cotton bales inward and finished goods outward, 24 hours a day. The human cost of Liverpool's prosperity was not incidental to the history of the port. It was central to it. Liverpool was the primary British port of the transatlantic slave trade for much of the 18th century. The triangular trade that took manufactured goods from Liverpool to West Africa, exchanged them for enslaved people, carried those people across the Atlantic to the Americas, and returned to Liverpool loaded with sugar and tobacco and cotton, was the financial foundation on which Liverpool's commercial expansion was built. The great dock-owning families of Liverpool, the Gladstones, whose fortune built a political dynasty that included a prime minister, the Earls, the Rawlinsons, the Haywoods, were many of them slave traders or financiers of the slave trade. The wealth of the port was inseparable from this horror, and the physical fabric of Liverpool, the banks, the warehouses, the civic buildings, was built with profits extracted from the suffering of millions of people across the Atlantic world. The Industrial Revolution transformed harbours in ways that had no precedent in maritime history. The invention of the steam-powered dredger meant that harbours could now be deepened and maintained at depths that would have been impossible before, allowing ships to grow progressively larger without being limited by the natural depth of available harbours. The iron hull, replacing the wooden hull that had served since the first boats were built, made ships bigger still. Iron could be formed into shapes and sizes that timber could not, and iron hulls were stronger and more watertight than wooden ones. The screw propeller, adopted from the 1840s onward, made steam-powered ships more efficient and reliable than the side-wheel paddle steamers of the earlier period, and the railway, connecting the port to the industrial interior, meant that the cargo moving through a major port no longer had to be limited by what could be carried by road or river from the surrounding region. A port connected by rail could draw on the industrial output of an entire country. Hamburg responded to these changes with characteristic energy. The port, already one of the major commercial centres of Northern Europe, invested enormously in the new harbour infrastructure that steam required: wet docks, warehouses, railway connections, mechanical handling, equipment. The Speicherstadt, the massive red brick warehouse district built on artificial islands in Hamburg's inner harbour between 1883 and 1927, is one of the great examples of industrial port architecture anywhere in the world. 7 square kilometres of warehouses, built on oak piles driven into the bed of the Elbe estuary, connected by canals that allowed lighters, small boats, to move goods between ships and storage at the water level, and by bridges that allowed road vehicles to access the upper floors of the warehouses from the street level above. It was a machine for storing and moving goods, built to a scale and with a sophistication that reflected Germany's industrial ambitions in the Wilhelmine era. Today, the Speicherstadt is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and has been converted into offices, museums, and the largest miniature railway museum in the world. The goods have moved elsewhere, but the architecture remains as the record of what a great industrial port looked like at the height of its power. Rotterdam, on the Rhine estuary in the Netherlands, had the geographical advantage of sitting at the mouth of the river that drained the most industrialized part of continental Europe, the Ruhr Valley in western Germany, where iron and coal and steel were produced in quantities that made Germany the industrial powerhouse of the late 19th century. The goods that came down the Rhine to Rotterdam, coal, steel, chemicals, manufactured goods, needed to be transferred to ocean-going ships for distribution to the world. Rotterdam became that transfer point, and its growth in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was explosive. The deep-water port of Europort, built in the 20th century on land reclaimed from the North Sea, extended Rotterdam's harbour capacity to the point where, for much of the second half of the 20th century, it was the busiest port in the world by total tonnage. It has since been surpassed by Asian ports, but it remains the largest port in Europe, handling roughly 450 million tons of cargo per year. The container revolution of the 1960s and 1970s is perhaps the least visible and most transformative event in the history of the port city. The shipping container, a standardized metal box typically 20 feet or 40 feet long, designed to be stacked on container ships and transferred by crane to rail cars and trucks without being opened, fundamentally changed the economics of moving goods by sea. Before containerization, cargo handling in ports was a labour-intensive process that required armies of dockers, stevedores, longshoremen, to move goods by hand from ships to warehouses and back. It was skilled, dangerous work, and the dockers were among the most unionised and politically powerful workers in port cities. After containerization, the same volume of cargo could be handled by a fraction of the labour, using giant cranes that moved containers between ships and land vehicles with mechanical efficiency. The result was a dramatic reduction in port labour, a dramatic increase in port capacity, and a significant change in where ports needed to be located. Container ships need deep water and flat land for vast container yards. The old city centre harbours, shallow, hemmed in by buildings, inaccessible to the enormous ships that containerization produced, were no longer suitable. The new container ports moved to the outer edges of estuaries, to purpose-built industrial zones far from the urban centres that the old ports had created. This is why the old harbour districts of so many great port cities, the East River waterfront in New York, the South Bank in London, the Old Port in Montreal, the waterfront of Baltimore, the docks of Liverpool, went into profound decline in the 1960s and 1970s, their warehouses empty, their quays abandoned, their crane gantries rusting against the sky. The commerce had moved, and with the commerce went the jobs and the money and the reason for anyone to be there. The old harbours became ruins. there is a photograph taken in Baltimore in 1972 that captures, in a single image, the condition of waterfront America at that moment. The foreground shows a stretch of the inner harbour, the old commercial harbour of Baltimore, surrounded by brick warehouses that were, at the time the photograph was taken, essentially empty. The warehouses are intact, their facades relatively clean, their windows dark. A few rusted bollards stand on the edge of the wharf. A single piece of old rope lies on the concrete. The harbour basin itself is still. No ships, no boats, barely any movement. In the background, the skyline of downtown Baltimore rises with its office towers and commercial buildings, busy and energetic and prosperous looking, completely ignoring the harbour at its feet. The city had turned its back on the water. This was the condition of almost every major waterfront in North America and much of Europe in the late 1960s and 1970s. The industries that had built the great harbour cities, the shipping companies, the warehousing operations, the manufacturing plants that used the waterfront for raw material delivery and product shipment, had either followed the container revolution to the new purpose-built ports on the urban periphery, or had simply declined as manufacturing moved to cheaper locations in Asia and Latin America. The workers who had depended on the waterfront for their livelihoods had lost those livelihoods. The neighbourhoods surrounding the old harbours had, in many cases, entered the cycle of unemployment and disinvestment that produces urban decay. And the water itself, the rivers and harbours that had been the original reason for the city's existence, had become, through decades of industrial use, seriously polluted. The Thames in London was so dirty by the mid-20th century that it contained virtually no fish. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland was so contaminated with industrial chemicals that it actually caught fire, not metaphorically but literally, in 1969, an event that became one of the galvanizing incidents of the American environmental movement. The reclamation of the waterfront began tentatively in the 1970s and became one of the defining urban design stories of the late 20th century. Baltimore's inner harbour was the most famous early example. The city, recognizing that the old commercial harbour was too valuable a piece of real estate to leave derelict, embarked in the early 1970s on a redevelopment plan that would transform the harbour basin and its surroundings into a mixed-use district of retail, restaurants, museums, hotels and public waterfront space. The National Aquarium, opened in 1981 on the Inner Harbour waterfront, was the project that catalysed the transformation, a major civic institution in a dramatic waterfront building that attracted visitors in numbers large enough to justify additional investment. The Harbour Place Pavilions, designed by Benjamin Thompson and Associates and opened in 1980, added retail and food services. Hotels followed, offices followed. The Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, the Maryland Science Center, the USS Constellation, a historic naval vessel, added to the attraction. By the late 1980s, Baltimore's inner harbour had become one of the most visited tourist destinations on the East Coast, and a model that other cities studied and attempted to replicate. London's transformation of its docklands, the vast area of abandoned docks stretching eastward from the city along the Thames, was on a much larger scale and involved far more political controversy. The London Docklands Development Corporation, established by the Thatcher government in 1981, was charged with regenerating an area of roughly 22 square kilometres that had been in decline since the 1960s. The approach it took, clearing the land, building infrastructure, offering generous tax incentives and planning permissions to private developers, attracted an enormous flow of capital into the area and produced, over the following 2 decades, a new district of office towers, apartment buildings, shops, and converted warehouses that bore very little resemblance to what had been there before. Canary Wharf, built on the site of the old West India docks, became a second central business district for London, housing the headquarters of major banks and financial institutions in towers that are now among the tallest in the country. The old dock basins, the enclosed water in which ships had once floated, became ornamental lakes Surrounded by apartments and restaurants and luxury shops, their water now serving no commercial purpose but performing a powerful psychological function, reminding people, at some level, that this is a waterfront, and waterfront is desirable. The desirability of water is something that the real estate market has demonstrated with extraordinary consistency in the past 30 years. Waterfront property commands a premium almost everywhere. Apartments with water views, houses on the water's edge, offices with harbour prospects. This premium is not rational in any simple economic sense. The water does not provide anything tangible that the property one block inland does not also provide. The view is pleasant but not useful, and yet the premium is real, persistent and global, suggesting that the human preference for water proximity is not merely a fashion, but something more deep-seated. Urban geographers have written extensively about this preference and its implications for the design of cities. The conclusion that most of them reach is that the preference is cultural, historical, and possibly even evolutionary. That human beings have been choosing water-adjacent locations for so long that the preference has become part of how we understand what a good place to be looks like. The environmental recovery of urban rivers and harbours has, in many cases, given the waterfront a new vitality that reinforces this preference. The Thames, cleaned up through stringent pollution controls in the 1960s and 1970s, now supports over 115 species of fish, including salmon. The return of salmon to the Thames after an absence of more than a century was widely celebrated as a symbol of environmental recovery. The Chicago River, once so polluted that the city reversed its flow to send its waste downstream rather than into Lake Michigan, has been transformed into a recreational amenity with kayaking, waterfront restaurants, and an architecture boat tour that is one of the city's most popular tourist attractions. The High Line in New York, a former elevated freight railway on the western edge of Manhattan, converted into a linear park, was not itself a waterfront project, but its spectacular success inspired dozens of similar waterfront reclamation projects in cities around the world. Sydney's harbour may be the most beautiful urban harbour on Earth, a claim that Sydney residents make with some frequency, and that visitors are often inclined to accept, at least while they are standing at the edge of the water looking at the bridge and the opera house, and the luminous quality of the light on the harbour at any time of day. The opera house, opened in 1973 after one of the most tortured and interesting architectural stories of the 20th century, was built on Bennelong Point, a peninsula jutting into the harbour that had previously served as a tram depot. Its position, surrounded by water on three sides, is what gives the building its extraordinary presence. The harbour did not merely provide the backdrop for the opera house, it is inseparable from the building's experience. The way the building relates to the water, the way the harbour frames it, the way the ferries pass by it, these are not incidental features of the building's setting. They are essential to what the building is and what it means. The harbour made the opera house possible as an icon, because the harbour is what gave the building its stage, and this, perhaps, is the deepest truth about the city and the water. The harbour is not just a commercial facility. It is not just a transportation hub. It is not just an environmental feature or a real estate amenity. It is, for the city that has lived beside it long enough, something closer to an identity. The city of the harbour is a particular kind of city, open, cosmopolitan, accustomed to strangers, oriented outward toward the world. It knows that the boats will come, because they have always come. It knows that the sailors will bring things from elsewhere, because they always have. It knows that the water, which looks like a boundary to people who have never been to sea, is actually a connection, the widest, most capacious connection available, leading everywhere that has water, which is almost everywhere on Earth. We've been travelling a long way tonight. From the first settlements on the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, where people who had never heard of cities were building the first ones without knowing what they were doing, through the Nile, which gave Egypt its soul and its calendar and its theology and its art, through the Aegean, where Greek city-states built their civilization on the sea and the sea gave them the world, through Rome, which called the Mediterranean its own and meant it, through the Indian Ocean's monsoon routes where Arab sailors had been crossing the open ocean centuries before Europeans dared to try, through the longship roads of the Vikings, who read rivers the way other people read maps, through the medieval port cities of Europe, where the harbours made fortunes that built cathedrals, through Venice, the city that should not exist and yet became the most sophisticated commercial civilization on Earth for a few centuries, through the Bosphorus, whose strategic importance has never diminished in 3,000 years of history, through the colonial ports that rearranged the world's commercial geography, through the river cities of America, which grew from the water and for the water and by the water, through the great industrial ports and their eventual decline, through the reclamation and rediscovery of the waterfront that has been one of the great urban stories of our own time. And the question we started with, why are almost all major cities near water, has by now answered itself many times over, in many different voices, from many different centuries. The water is there because the water provides. It provides drinking water and fish, and fertile silt. It provides transportation, without which commerce cannot exist and cities cannot grow. It provides natural defence, without which settlements of any size are perpetually vulnerable. It provides connection to the wider world, without which a community cannot trade and cannot therefore accumulate the surplus that allows it to become more than a village. It provides the cosmopolitan energy that comes from harbours, where strangers arrive continuously with the things they have and the things they know and the ideas they carry in their heads from somewhere you have never been. It provides, in more recent centuries, the real estate premium and the aesthetic pleasure and the recreational access that make urban waterfronts among the most desirable and valuable places in any city. But there is something else that the water provides, something harder to quantify but no less real. The water provides a certain kind of perspective. Standing at the edge of a harbour at night, or at the bend of a great river, or on the bank of a wide estuary as the tide goes out, there is a sense of scale, of the larger world, of the immensity of what lies beyond the visible horizon. The sailor feels this most acutely, because the sailor knows from experience that the horizon is not an ending but a continuation, that beyond it lies more water, more coastline, more harbour, more city. But anyone standing at the water's edge can feel some version of it. The city, which can feel so enclosed, so complete, so sufficient unto itself, opens at the waterfront. It admits the possibility of beyond. The great harbours of history were always, in some sense, philosophical instruments. They taught the cities beside them that the world was larger than the city, that people elsewhere were building their own cities, conducting their own commerce, thinking their own thoughts, living their own lives that were fully as complex and fully as real as the lives being lived here. The harbour brought a fragment of that elsewhere into the city, in the form of goods, of course, but also in the form of the sailors and merchants who carried those goods, who spoke other languages and prayed to other gods and had different stories to tell. The city absorbed some of that, always. It could not help itself. The harbour was the door, and the door was always open. There are cities today that are trying to cut themselves off from that openness, that are building walls of economic nationalism and cultural suspicion and political hostility to the stranger who arrives by sea. And there are cities that are doubling down on their harbour openness, that are investing in their waterfront connections, that are making their harbours more accessible and their port communities more welcome. The historical record is fairly clear about which approach has produced more prosperous, more creative and more enduring cities. But history is not always persuasive to the people who are living it. What is perhaps most remarkable, when you have followed this story from its beginning to its present moment, is the sheer continuity of it. The story of the city and the water is not several separate stories happening in different places at different times. It is one story, continuous and connected, beginning at the banks of the first river settlement and running, unbroken, to the container ships unloading their cargo at Rotterdam or Shanghai or Los Angeles right now, tonight, while you're listening to this. The same logic that put the first Sumerian city on the Euphrates put those container ships on the sea. The logic is very simple, really, even if the world it has built is very complex. Go where the water is, because the water goes everywhere. And everywhere the water goes, there is the possibility of a city. If you have made it to this point in the story, then you have spent a considerable number of hours thinking about rivers and harbours and the people who built their lives beside them. The Sumerian priest measuring the Euphrates flood, the Phoenician merchant calculating a monsoon passage, the Norse sailor reading the stars above the North Atlantic, the Venetian glass blower looking out over the lagoon, the dockside crane operator loading a container ship at Rotterdam. They are all, in some sense, the same person. They are all people who understood that the water was not a barrier, it was a road. And roads lead to other people, and other people in the long run are what cities are made of. The water is still there. It still remembers. In the curve of the Thames through London, in the bend of the Seine through Paris, in the vast brown patience of the Mississippi making its way to the sea, in the Bosphorus threading between continents with its eternal parade of ships. These rivers and straits and harbours have watched more human drama than any other category of geography on Earth. They have seen armies and fleets, famines and festivals, the rise and fall of empires, the slow accumulation of civilization across millennia. They were there before the cities. They will in all probability be there after them, and in between, in this brief, extraordinary interval of human history during which we have been building and rebuilding and reimagining what a city can be. The water has been the constant, the foundation beneath the foundations, the reason before the reason. Take a moment wherever you are right now to think about the nearest body of water to the city you're in, or near or from, the river or the harbour or the bay or the coast. Think about how old that water is, how many centuries it has been flowing past that same bank, carrying its sediment, reflecting the sky, rising and falling with the tides or the rains or the snowmelt far upstream. Think about all the people who have stood at its edge before you and seen in it the same thing you might see, the possibility of elsewhere, the connection to something larger than the city, the road that goes on past the horizon into the great continuous world. The water is still there, and so, because of it, are we.